I'm delighted to invite Dorry Holland to speak for us next. And Dorry was a deputy principal initially before she moved into the National Educational Psychological Services. She's a very, very keen interest in the whole area of educational disadvantage, of emotional and behavioural problems. She's has trained teachers. I mentioned wellbeing this morning. There'll be some information on that also. But basically, we were delighted to include this type of presentation in the day because mental health issues and health and wellbeing it's just overarching, isn't it, over all the issues that we come across. So, Dorry, I'd be delighted for you'd invite you to speak.
Right, okay. Well, as you know, my name is Dorry Holland. I'm with the National Educational Psychological Service. Can you all hear me okay? And my brief here today is to talk to you about well-being in primary schools and post-primary schools. So it's a move away from what you've been talking about, sort of how you react or how you deal with certain situations. If you think of what I'm talking about as the foundations of the wall, okay, that if you have the foundations of a wall right, you can withstand pressure. So think of well-being as that, and that's what we're talking about today, and we're talking about it as it relates to schools, so primarily working with schools, okay? So who are we? Well, we're called NEPS. You probably have heard of us, I know some of you have. We're the National Educational Psychological Service, and we're a national service. We work with primary and post-primary schools. All in all, we have 3,680 primary and post-primary schools, and there are 170 psychologists. We're part of the Department of Education and Skills. And because we're educational psychologists, we deal with all aspects of learning. So we do psychological assessments in relation to learning difficulties, whether they're general learning difficulties or specific as in dyslexia. We also consult with schools about children, particularly, I suppose, in relation to behavioural difficulties. And how you would deal with behavioural difficulties and how you would support children's social and emotional development. And we have programmes that we run in schools, such as the Incredible Years programme. I'm sure you might have heard of that over time. Different programmes, Zippy's Friends is one that's done in Cork a lot, similar ideas, on promoting social and emotional competencies, which is the ability to deal with life's challenges, really. And each NEP psychologist is assigned a group of schools. It might seem we're very low, sparse on the ground with 170 and that number of schools. So we have 8 regional offices, 2 in Dublin, Galway, Limerick, Sligo, Navan. You're assigned schools based on the size of the school. So I work in the Dublin area, so my schools would be fairly close. But if I worked up in Inishowen, I could have 30 schools. Because a lot of, small primary schools, so you'd have 2 teacher schools and 3 teacher schools. And so, it's harder to get around. So what they do in those situations, they cluster in schools when they want to deliver programs. So what is mental health and why are we concerned in it? Now, there are lots of definitions for mental health, and I'm not going to run through them all, but this is the one that sort of, I noticed a sub-theme of your conference was developing children's potential. And you'll hear me using the word children, but I mean up to age 18, okay? But developing, so this is mental health. Mental health, when people think of mental health, they sometimes think of an absence of mental illness. When you think of mental health, and sometimes when we go into schools and we talk to teachers and we talk about mental health, and they say, no, I don't know anything about mental health. I do more harm than good. What do I know about, ADD or ADHD or behavioural difficulties? But mental health is more than the absence of mental illness. And this is the World Health Organization. So it's a state of well-being in which the individual realises his or her own abilities, gets their potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Basically, it's about how we feel about ourselves, how we cope with the stresses and problems of life, and as a result, and how we feel, our sense of self-worth, that we are worth something. And why are we concerned with mental health? Well, mental health, as you can see, it permeates all aspects of life. Let's have a look at statistics. This is relation to suicide, okay, which is an unfortunate consequence sometimes. As you can see, I know you probably can't see it that well. Can you see it okay? All right, so you can see here we are. We're about average for the European average. Not that average is acceptable, but that's where we are on the list. Now, I was showing this slide to somebody else last week, and if you look at the countries up at the top, you'll see Lithuania, is it Latvia? Yeah, those countries. Look at the bottom, you'll see Malta, Greece. We had a very non-scientific conversation, and we were saying, why is it so high in Lithuania and Latvia and so low in Malta and Greece? And we wondered, was the weather a factor in, was it the Mediterranean diet? No scientific basis for this conclusion now. But would it be the blue skies and the fine weather and the eating out and all of that? And look at the other countries, the ones up the top. What do you notice? Yeah, they're former Eastern Bloc countries, which would have had a very sort of controlling type of government. Also, maybe, haven't developed their support services as well. Okay, so that's how we rate when it comes to the European average in suicide. However, have a look at this. This is how we rate when it's in the ages 15 to 24. And this data now is 2013. So that's why we are concerned with mental health. And that's why we're involved in mental health. And you can see how high we are. And you'll see that Malta and Greece are still down at the bottom, although maybe those have changed now in recent years. One word of caution in this, there may be a degree of underreporting in some countries, that the data may not be as robust as we think, and that maybe it's just not recorded in some countries. But that's how we stand. So that is why we're concerned with the issue of mental health. Are you surprised by that, or did you already know that? You're surprised? I was too, when I was preparing this, to see how high we are. Okay, now, that's 2013. Mental health is a very hot issue, if you can, to say it. It gathers a lot of media attention. As a result, it's getting a lot of more resources, So perhaps now, in 2015, our stats might be a bit better, okay? But we are really focusing in on the mental health of our young people. If you want to look at the Irish context, there was a Headstrong, which is a major organisation, and other organisations did a My World survey. And you can see there the 14,000 young people took part in it. And the majority of young people were found to be functioning well across a variety of mental health indicators. 2 in 3 reported no problems with depression, anxiety, or stress. Depression, anxiety, and stress are the most commonly reported mental health difficulties. Almost half reported that they cope well with problems. I could talk to you all day about teaching children how to solve problems and how to understand the consequences. You start in the primary school, you have a little child in the yard, and maybe somebody is bullying them. And, you could talk them through, what could you do? Well, one thing I could do is I could hit him. Yeah, I could. And what would be the consequences of that? Well, I'd probably get in trouble with the teacher and have to go to the principal and be calling up my mammy and daddy. Okay, what else could you do? Well, I could walk away and I could ignore it, but then what would happen? Then you might bully me again tomorrow and the next day. So what else could you do? It starts very early in life, and it starts at home as well. It's talking about and taking everything, not being judgmental, saying you wouldn't, my God, you wouldn't hit him. But not being judgmental, being very calm, evaluating what are the solutions, what are the consequences of the solutions, and which is the best solution to pick in the circumstances. And that starts very young. And if those skills are taught very early, then they can be used to solve more complex problems as things go by. And so you don't get into that tunnel where the only solution is, alcohol, drugs, or taking your own life. Also, things like conflict resolution skills, how to argue. And Rita was talking there about aggression. And it's okay. Children can feel angry. If you can feel happy, you can feel angry. But it's how you handle the anger is what it is, okay? So, hitting people, using violence, kicking, that is not an appropriate, but one still can feel anger, and you can acknowledge, yes, you do feel angry, but how can you deal with it? I could talk all day on that, but I'll move on, okay? So that, and 2 in 3 reported they enjoy family life and talk to somebody when they have a problem, okay? However, on the downside, 10% reported significant personal problems. 1 in 3 experienced some level of mental health difficulties. 1 in 5 engaged in self-harm. And I was listening to the radio yesterday, and I hear that there's a rise in male self-harm, particularly amongst younger boys. And 7% reported a suicide attempt. All right, and that is all within the young age group of up to age 17. And yet, only, is it 13% of young men and 33% of young women access mental health care. So it is in that context that the schools have a central role to play in the development of mental health and well-being. We called our documents well-being. Up on the very top, there's mental health promotion in primary schools. We used trying to move away from the idea of mental health into the idea of well-being. It's how you feel about yourself, your well-being. Excuse me. So these are the 3 documents that are currently available to schools. Sorry. The first one was launched, does that say well-being in primary, the well-being in post-primary schools, okay? Well-being in post-primary schools was the first one that was launched, and it was launched in 2013. At the time, Rory Quinn, I remember he launched it, and he got into terrible trouble in the press, because, you probably don't remember this, but I do, because he said, mental health is everybody's concern, even the caretaker, something to that effect. And he was like castigated in the press for saying, imagine saying that, mental health is everyone's concern, like that should be left to the professionals. He probably would have been better if he'd used the word well-being, okay, because we're much more tolerant of the word well-being. So that was produced in 2013. It was followed this year by the mental health in primary schools, okay, and a resource document. There's another document as well. It's about care teams in post-primary schools. And they lay out practical advice for schools on how to develop and how to promote mental health and well-being. Now, schools do a great job, okay, but it brings together in one spot, the advice. It brings together the statistics that I spoke to you about and lots of others that are there about the reasons for. It asks schools to evaluate how they're currently doing. Okay, the key messages of the document would be a positive school climate and culture is fundamental to a child's well-being, okay? That whole idea of a positive school, a school that is welcoming, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, a school that is tolerant of differences. We're developing guidelines on the moment on transgender, things are about tolerating all the differences that there are, about putting programs and interventions in place that cope with the areas of difficulty. You spoke about granny, Rita, when you were talking about, and it is true, this has come out so clearly in the research. The presence of one supportive adult in a child's life, in a person's life, can make the difference. It can develop that sense of connectedness, of belonging, of support. And as we said, it's often granny, but it could be you in your role in the community or in your school. It could be a teacher. It could be a relation. It is somebody. Think to yourself, when you went to school, did you have one person there who was that kind of supportive adult, who sort of stuck with you, who wasn't blind to your faults, but who stuck with you? That person, that one supportive, think back to your own times and think of that one supportive adult. It's so important, as is the sense of belonging. The sense of belonging to something. The more vulnerable the young person, the higher the risk of increased mental health difficulties. I'll come back to that in a second. And a young person's ability to recognise and express their emotions is fundamental to his or her capacity to learn. Unless you get all these matters sorted out, you can't learn. So you need to sort out how all the mental health difficulties or learn to cope with them. As well as that, I talked about, how anger, how it's okay to be angry, it's how you express it. Just to come back to the more vulnerable, the young person, the higher the risk. The World Health Organization talks about risk and protective factors in mental health. I'm not going to go into them now, but I brought a list of them with me just to call out some of them. You know that risk factors in mental health would be things like abuse, neglect, family conflict, physical and mental disabilities, stressful life events. There's a lot, okay? Poor self-image, all right? There are protective factors then, and protective factors would be a sense of security, taking exercise, good social skills, good parental parenting, positive parenting, instead of harsh and inconsistent parenting, which means that a child one day, that sense of security, if a parent or a teacher has inconsistent parenting or inconsistent teaching, the child can't decide. We were talking about boundaries. The child can't decide, oh, I wonder how it's going to be today, or it's going to be different tomorrow. If I was able to get away with it yesterday, but today I wasn't. Today they've come down on me like a ton of bricks. Often in schools you'll have children who have learning disabilities, and particularly in post-primary schools where you change from teacher to teacher, and you're going to have a teacher who's quite, relaxed, and then you have a teacher who's, more strict, and often children can't make out the difference, and they sort of walk right into trouble with the teacher because they're behaving like they did with the relaxed teacher. So all of that has to be taken into account. So you talk about risk factors, and you talk about protective factors, and the aim is to reduce the risk factors and enhance the protective factors. And that is really what we're trying to do, is reduce the risk factors. We can't cure everything, but enhance the protective factors. When it comes to school, there are some extra sort of risk factors. One of them would be, for example, low school attendance. Remember we were talking about that sense of connectedness and the one supportive adult. Often when we come into schools, we take our referrals to schools. So schools send us, a referral form. We deal with it. And on that, there's a place for attendance. And you will see a child who's, let's say, missed 15 days in the school year. 15 days, if you divide by 5, is 3 weeks, okay? But and sometimes that can be for very valid reasons, like they were in hospital or something like that. But sometimes you will see 15 days this year, 20 last year, 14. And so this is this pattern of disengagement happening. So it doesn't just affect learning. It affects the fact that they're not in the football team because they can't be trusted. They'll be out the day of the practice or they'll be out the day of the match. So that whole sense of connectedness is being lost. Protective factors in school would obviously be the positive school environment, that positive relationship, that good discipline, and the boundaries. What we talk about in the document is we talk about support for all children, okay? Support for everybody, okay? Support then for some children who have more difficulties. And then support, what we call for a few, would be there are some children who have very particular difficulties, sometimes involving other agencies, such as child and adolescent mental health services. So it lays out it asks schools to look at their environment, both the social environment and the physical environment. Is the school warm and welcoming? When you walk into the school, you get that sense of warm and welcoming. Is there good relationships between the staff and between the children? It asks to look at the most important one, which would be the SPHE curriculum. Are there curricula, being fully implemented? And the backbone of developing mental health in schools is the SPHE curriculum. The SPHE curriculum is copied in other schools around Europe because of its effectiveness. It deals with, I know you're concerned today about drugs, it deals with all aspects. It starts in the primary school, in the junior classes, and goes all the way up to second level. And it deals with it's divided into 3 strands: myself, and others, and myself and the wider community. With age appropriate, it talks about yes feelings and no feelings for children. It deals with the whole area of abuse. It deals with the whole area of problem solving. It deals with the whole area of making good choices and bad choices, all the way up through drugs education and relationships and sexuality education as well. There's one other area that I need to talk about, and it's this. I'm sure you've heard of, critical instance, what we call it. It's our other document, and it's been around for a while. A critical incident, as we define it, is anything that overwhelms the normal working of a school. Last weekend, there were, severe incidents in 2 parts of Ireland, in Glenamuck and in Louth. they're called critical incidents, okay? And a school, there is a policy schools have to be ready to respond to. But the normal type of incidents that we also respond to are things like suicide, attempted suicide, violent death, traffic accidents, accidental death, drowning, sudden deaths and illnesses. Sadly, not all of these overwhelm schools because they've experienced them before and they know what to do. We don't use the word suicide when we talk about suicide. We use the word tragic death, okay? Because of, the sensibilities for the family. And also, legally, it's not a suicide until it's been ruled a suicide by the coroner, okay? Similarly, we use the word violent death. We'd never use the word murder or murdered, okay? What schools have to have, we're involved in prevention. All I've been talking about, the well-being and supporting well-being and how one supports well-being, that's there, that's the prevention. That's what I was talking about, the foundations on the wall, okay? But when it happens, it usually happens without any warning, and you have to be ready to go. So every school must have what's called a critical incident policy, which is a plan, okay? And the guidelines that we have outline everything that we need for a plan. Now, not everything will require the level of response that big media, like we had incidences in Cork, and we had incidences in Carlow, which were like major events, okay? But that the schools know what it is they must do. Do they need a person to speak to the media? Who is that person who speaks to the media? Nobody else speaks, only the person that's appointed. Is there a room for parents to come? Is there somebody manning the phones? All the practical things that need to be done. Is there a place that children can go to be quiet? When they have a quiet place to think, one of the things we pick up is picking up on vulnerable students. In the event, let's say, of a suicide. Who are the most vulnerable that must get special attention? And you would pick out vulnerable students from friends, obviously. Maybe children who have witnessed it or who have seen it, or who are aware of it. And also students who have stressful events or vulnerable situations themselves that you need to keep an eye on. And they would need to be monitored. I was reading research that if you have a close friend or associate who has died by suicide, that you should continue to monitor that person for 6 months to a year afterwards, as your likelihood of taking your own life increases by 50%, which was it's something that we need to bring back to schools, that it's not just looking after them for 5 or 6 or 7 weeks after the incident, but making sure that they're monitored and checked in, which would be the role of the guidance counsellors and the teachers in the school. In a way, by the time the critical incident happens, we're more like, the rear view mirror. We're not there up front. It's the school that's up front, and we're in the back trying to sort of manage it and pick up the things that need to be picked up. And then obviously we have a role in the following up, which would be what I talked about, monitoring students. Do we need to send off students? Students need to be referred for more in-depth counselling. Do we need to tidy up the policy? And things like, reviewing it and how we remember the student or the parent or the teacher who has died or whatever as a result of it. It's a very negative note, I know, to finish on, when I've been talking about health and well-being. But it is a very important part of it, to be there when people are at their weakest and to support those who are at their weakest. So there are the documents. They can be accessed through the Department of Education websites. You can access those documents yourselves, okay? If you just go on to, it's a big long address, but if you go on to www.education.ie and put in NEPS in this little search engine, you'll come down to resources and publications, okay? And all those documents are there because recently there was an incident in a football club. I was there as well. I mean, there are some very useful, in the critical instance, there are some very useful guidelines on, the stages of grief, and small children have a very concrete, understanding of grief. They're there. And as parents, we've also developed a list of handouts. This has nothing to do with mental health, but we've also developed a list of handouts that you could find particularly useful. That would be, for your own kids or for kids that you're working with, things on just school issues like organisation and homework and self-esteem and all those things, reading and things like that. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Okay, is that all right? Unplug me.